Alright, everybody, for a special, double critical thought for today, I realized when I uploaded the piece about boss design that I put it in the wrong order. So this is going to be the correction, and I'll take down that video as well. But a few days ago, there is an article on PC Gamer regarding boss design in video games, and how a lot of people were against bosses. They felt they don't serve a purpose anymore. And I couldn't find that further from the truth. And good boss design is an essential part of any game design. And over the years, we have seen bosses in all shapes and sizes and even genres as well. But when it comes to a good boss, there are usually two specific schools of thought when it comes to designing a boss to properly challenge the player. The first is essentially a one-off kind of challenge. This is something that is very specific or unique towards that fight. You can look at this as examples of, let's say I'm doing a third-person action game, the boss could be a stealth battle. A good example would be something like the Scarecrow sections in Batman Arkham Asylum, or even the Mr. Freeze fight in Arkham City. The other kind of boss is the kind that will test the player on their knowledge of the game or its mechanics. This is typically seen in any kind of action-based game, from Dark Souls to Devil May Cry to even something like in Mario. The point is that this boss is built against the player's mechanics or the core gameplay loop, and it's up to the player to figure out how to get around it. And both fights have their own strengths and weaknesses. A one-off battle requires things to be a lot more unique, and we typically see this not as built around the entire game, meaning every boss battle is a completely different one-off fight, because that's going to add a lot more work to it. But they're usually used as a way to break things up, and that's another major role that boss fights are meant to have when you're designing a game. They're supposed to be there to break up the flow of the normal gameplay. And it's kind of a way of, quote-unquote, rewarding the player for getting through a level. And this can be another useful way to affect the pacing or flow, especially if your core gameplay loop is something that's going to repeat over how many hours of play you're designing it for. And a great boss fight can sort of be that a cherry on top at the end of the section, a way to let the player kind of get out of the rut of what they've just done and do something a little bit differently. And of course, there's the fanfare or celebration that can happen once you have hopefully beaten that boss. But a great boss fight at the end of the day has to test the player. It can't just be a normal enemy, but now they're bigger, or they're a different color, stuff like that. And this is one of the big problems that first-person shooters have ran into a lot over the last 20 or maybe even 30 years at this point. And that is, if your core gameplay loop is so strict or so well defined, it can be hard to create an enemy that's actually meant to test the player in a different route. And what we see is that most bosses in a first-person shooter will either go the bullet sponge route, i.e. stuff like the Cyber Demon in Doom, all the name guys you fight in Borderlands, or it'll be some kind of strange thing that you have to attack a little bit differently, or maybe there's something else in the environment you have to use to weaken them. And Borderlands has had a few bosses like that, and I'm sure there's been other first-person shooters that have done things as well. The problem, though, if the player is already at basically peak performance while they're running through the level, shooting, jumping, dodging, you name it, it's kind of hard to develop something that's an elevated or a higher test than that. And most great bosses that we've seen come from the action genre, because you can always push the player's skill level a little bit higher. Maybe the boss can't be blocked, or maybe the boss can dodge around your own attacks. It's just a way of tweaking things to say that this guy is different from everything else that you fought. Now, when it comes to designing bosses along those lines, you have to be really careful with how far you go in terms of, quote-unquote, rule breaking. Because if you remove too many of the player's options, then the boss fight becomes repetitive and can be seen as unfair. A great example of this is from the JRPG genre, where you'll have bosses that I'm immune to poison, stone, curse, slowdown, burning, freezing, bleeding. Everything else that the enemies can be susceptible to, the boss isn't. And the problem with that is that it completely ruins any kind of strategies or builds that are centered around those other points. If you're going to give the player the ability to poison an enemy, make it the boss susceptible to it. Now, you can of course limit them if you're trying to build a boss around other options. The Shin Megami Tensei series has been really great with unique defined bosses, where yes, the boss may be immune to poison or slow, whatever, but they have something special that they're going to do to mix things up. Such as, let's say, every 5 turns, the boss is going to switch their weakness. So instead of being weak to fire, they'll be weak to ice, or lightning, or whatever you want to call it. Just a way of saying that this boss fight is completely different from the normal enemies, and it's completely different from the other bosses that you fight. Now, before we get to the final part, I want to throw this back to you folks, since I asked this in the first version of this video. When you look at good bosses, are you a fan of bosses that are meant to be one-off or a specific kind of way to fight them, as in a puzzle kind of fight, which we'll talk more about in a minute, or do you prefer bosses to be very similar to the player's own moveset? So it essentially becomes like a one-on-one duel, in a matter of speaking. But the final part that I want to discuss for today, and this is a major element of boss design, is a fixed pattern versus a randomized pattern. Now, for any boss that has been designed in the history of video games, they are built on a set number of attacks predefined by the player. Whether the boss, will throw a fireball, do some kind of like crazy jump at you, or anything like that. The difference in philosophy comes with how the boss decides what attacks to use. And a fixed pattern means the boss will behave the same way every time without question. And this is where we kind of get the quote-unquote puzzle fights, where the only way to beat the boss is that you must do X, Y, and Z in a specific order or a specific condition, or you can't hurt the boss. Platformers and action-adventure games are very notorious for these kinds of fights. If you've played a Mario game, the older Zeldas, Ratchet and Clank, Jak and Daxter, you name it, that's what these bosses are built around. Where the boss will do something, you have to either wait for him to, get tired or turn around, and then you hit the glowy bit, or there's something in the environment that you have to trick the boss into either running into or you use yourself, and then that makes the boss susceptible to then you do damage. A very interesting point is that you can tell these fights because no matter how many times you hit the boss will always do this like major reaction to indicate that you've actually have hit him. It's kind of a way of saying that this boss really only has 3 points of health, but it's disguised by the fact that you're just like whacking him or punching him for 5 to 10 seconds. And then what happens is that as you take these points of damage, the boss will change the pattern, or let's say becomes harder to do the second or third time. Maybe instead of you just being able to jump over to the switch, now there's spike orbs floating around, or the boss will try attacking you in the process. A random pattern is when a boss will have a full set of moves to use, but they're going to use them in a randomized order. This is usually based on proximity and sometimes the boss's health. And what this does is, I know what the boss can do. I just don't know when he's going to do it. And the perfect example of how this works is the Soulsborne series. Every boss, whether it is Champion Gundyr to Ludwig to Father Gascoigne, they have a set number of attacks that they're going to do. But you have no idea what they're going to do at any given time. You can manipulate RNG to some extent by being in specific spots or being a certain distance away from the boss. But that's all you can do. And that's what makes these fights so exciting. By the fact that it kind of feels like you're actively engaging with this enemy rather than just repeating the same 2 or 3 moves and then the boss dies. And for myself, I prefer these kinds of battles over the puzzle-based or fixed pattern ones. And that's why I want to ask you folks, what do you think? Some bosses, as mentioned when I did the last version of this, someone brought up Kingdom Hearts with the Oogie Boogie fight that kind of combined them both. You had to fight the boss, but you also had to deal with the slot machine, or I'm sorry, the roulette wheel that was going around. And that can certainly be an interesting case. But for myself, give me these Soulsborne fights. Give me Father Gascone, Ludwig, even stuff like Champion Gundyr or Unnamed King. I like those one-on-one, just like big old duel fights where you have to improvise while still keeping track of what's going on. But to wrap things up, a good boss is meant to test the player's mastery or provide like a cathartic break from the rest of the action. And when they're done properly, they can be that, ribbon or tying the bow at the end of the level. And the best bosses can go on to become legendary or be fond memories of playing the game. But like I said at the start, any genre can have a boss fight associated to it. You just have to be clever. I've seen puzzle-based bosses in games like Space Chem or Catherine. I'm sure there are Tetris or that Match 3 style boss fights as well. So a new question for this video, can you think of bosses in genres that typically don't have them? And one more, there were bosses in Diddy Kong Racing, which is a go-kart based racing game as well. But let me know what you think in the comments below, and thank you so much for watching, I guess, the second take at the Critical Thought for today. Be sure to check back for daily discussions on game design here, and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. Until next time, have a great day. Before we get to the credits, just want to give a quick shout out to the fans and supporters over on patreon.com/gwbicer. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. Check back around 10 Eastern for regular streaming. If you'd like to suggest games for me to cover or topics to talk about, let me know in the comments below. For a collection of my writings as well as weekly podcasts on design, check out game-wisdom.com. To support the Game Wisdom Patreon, you can find us on there on patreon.com/gwbicer. $1 will get you into our private Discord channel where we talk game topics and more. $5 will get you voting privileges for any major event, including the Saturday Night Grab Bag, Patreon-funded goals, and more. Thanks again for watching, and I hope you enjoy more videos here on the Game Wisdom YouTube channel.